HMS Thunderchild is one of the world's best-known warships that never actually existed. But the question has raged ever since pretty much the day War of the Worlds was published. What exactly was HMS Thunderchild? It's been depicted in many forms in various media, everything from a small destroyer up to a pre-dreadnought battleship, and everything else in between. But really, what do we actually know about the ship, and therefore what conclusion can we draw as to what kind of form it might actually have taken had it ever been real? A number of theories have been advanced, a lot of them based around the fact that the Thunderchild is described as a ram, and the only ram that was historically in Royal Navy service was HMS Polyphemus, and thus the inference is made that Polyphemus must be the basis of the Thunderchild. Now, there was one other harbour defence ram of some size that made it into service, and that was USS Katahdin. But both of these ships, I don't think, actually reflect what Wells had in mind. I believe that the Thunderchild as depicted in War of the Worlds is a somewhat more unique vessel, and I shall describe why by going over what we know from the book itself. The ship is described as a torpedo ram, and also as sitting low in the water, looking almost waterlogged. So it has to be not the high-sided pre-dreadnought that's so often depicted. It's also called an ironclad. Now this will become very interesting later on because an ironclad, well, by inference, must have relatively decent iron armour. The next factor, and another one that's going to be critical in our examination, is that this version of the torpedo ram, i.e. the Thunderchild, has guns, and it has fairly significant guns, because during its run-in, not only is it described as firing multiple guns at the Martians, but one of the rounds is described as travelling several miles, ricocheting off the water, and then smashing a small fishing boat into matchwood with a single hit. That implies a gun that can both fire at fair distance and has a significant level of firepower. Additionally, the Thunderchild was capable of moving quite quickly, as its wake was able to toss around the small steamer that the point-of-view character was on, and it was able to close the distance most of the way to the Martian tripods before they had much of a chance to identify what exactly it was. Then, when we look at how it died, when the engines were compromised by the heat ray and eventually explode, enough of the forward part of the ship is left intact to complete its ramming sequence and keep on going. Now, all of this, to me, suggests that the ship is not anything like what we see was built historically. Polyphemus and Katahdin are actually far too small in this category. And there are other issues which I'll go into now. So, the reason why I'm disqualifying ships designed like Polyphemus and Katahdin are as follows. The War of the Worlds is set at the turn of the 19th going into the 20th centuries. Now, ships of that period are actually relatively quick. The pre-dreadnoughts that are under construction at the time could make around 18 knots, and various cruisers can make in the low to mid-20s. Polyphemus, on the other hand, was built almost 2 decades prior and was at absolute best capable of 17 to 18 knots, so it's not going to be particularly swift by the standards of the turn of the 19th century, and Thunderchild most definitely is. Katahdin is even slower at 16 knots, so their engine power and such like is not really up to scratch. Now, the next thing to consider is protection. Polyphemus was not an ironclad. She had deck armour and a conning tower, but she did not have armoured sides. Katahdin did have some armoured sides, but as we said, is a bit too slow. So Katahdin is meeting one criteria, Polyphemus is meeting none so far. But what about gunpowder? Well, Polyphemus has a few 1-inch Nordenfeldts, Katahdin has a few 6-pounders. Neither of those guns are particularly long range, and certainly you're not going to be smashing an entire fishing boat to pieces with a single hit from either weapon. In fact, I doubt Polyphemus would be able to sink a fishing boat over the course of several minutes with a few 1-inch Nordenfeldts. Katadyn might stand a little bit of a better chance if it really poured on with the 6-pounders, but even so, that's nothing like what's described in the book. Both vessels also displace around 2 to 2,500 tons, and thus their wake is not going to be that substantial when compared to a cross-channel steamer ferry. The wake would be considerable if you're in a rowboat, perhaps, but something in this order moving 80 knots is not going to generate a wake capable of tossing around a steamer that has several dozen, if not a few hundred people aboard. So displacement-wise, both of the existing torpedo rams are also out of the running on these grounds. And finally, you have the manner of the Thunderchild's death. As I mentioned, when the engines detonated, the ship remained substantially intact and was able to continue with its ramming procedure. Now, being able to survive the detonation of your engines like that, that alone speaks to a relatively substantial ship. But the other thing to take into account is when you look at the Katadyn and the Polyphemus, they both have their boiler plants pretty much amidships or slightly forward of amidships, which means that in the event of a heat lance strike on the boiler room, not only is that going to core through the ship right at the centre of mass, which is obviously bad for its continued structural stability, but the boilers going up is going to incinerate pretty much anybody on the bridge, which is going to leave it completely out of control, and is probably going to break the ship clean in half right there and then. None of which really speaks to the ship being able to continue onwards with enough momentum to take down a Martian tripod. Now, has anyone else tried to take these factors into account? Well, yes. If you Google for the Kansas City Kit Company, in one of their blogs in April 2015, they actually considered modelling a version of HMS Thunderchild, and they ran into the similar issues that we've just described, and they came up with a design that was based on the Siegfried-class coastal defence battleship of Germany, the HMS Beowulf, which you can see on screen now. Now, this design does address some of the issues that are inherent to the original torpedo rams that were actually built in recorded history. It's 3,500 metric tons, so it's substantially larger, which would allow for a decent wake to form. It's armed, in this case, with 3 single 9.4-inch guns, which would certainly be capable of dealing some pretty nasty damage to a small fishing boat. But, on the other hand, it's even slower than Katadyn, and it's only capable of about 14 knots. But on the plus side, it does actually have waterline belt armour at 9.4 inches thick maximum. The bridge is also somewhat forward of the funnel and thus may well survive a boiler blast, but unfortunately again, from the position of the funnel, the boilers are once more pretty much dead set amidships, which doesn't speak well to their proposed survivability, and the Beowulf and the Siegfried class in general are definitely fairly high-sided vessels, so quite noticeable, and therefore do not fit the criteria of being described as low in the water, as per H.G. Wells' account. The other issue is that the Siegfried class has a distinct tumble-home design, as well as a kind of scalloped turret setup, both of which are characteristic of a number of European designs, but are quite different from any extant British designs. And of course, Thunderchild is, at the time, Her Majesty's ship, Thunderchild, the product of the Royal Navy, and thus any design for Thunderchild should fit within the design specifications and style of the late 19th century Royal Navy. So I got to thinking, what exactly would the Thunderchild have looked like based on these criteria? And I was lucky enough to be contacted by a very wonderful subscriber by the name of Baron Engel, who has much more artistic talent when it comes to these things than I do. And so we got our heads together, and I started describing what I was thinking about, and he started drawing, and we came up with a design. Link to all of his contact details, etc., and examples of previous work in the video description below. And if you have a warship design commission that you'd like to undertake, I would seriously recommend considering his services, as you'll see a little bit later on. But first, let me describe the theoretical thought process to you. The British Admiralty in the late 1880s and early 1890s would have been faced with a problem. For whatever reason, in the timeline of H.G. Wells, torpedo rams are still seen as a viable proposition. However, the advances in gun technology, especially in terms of quick-firing guns, as well as the advances in boiler technology allowing for greater speed, have meant that the Polyphemus is pretty much obsolete as a frontline unit, so they need to come up with something new. A torpedo ram is going to have to get in close, and to get in close means that they can't afford to have a ship with particularly high sides because they're trying to minimize the target profile. However, they also need to have a ship that carries enough firepower to bludgeon its way through escorts, bearing in mind that torpedo boats are beginning to make an appearance, as well as the occasional cruiser. Given that it might not be able to connect with its ram, it needs to also have the capability of dealing fairly significant damage up close, as well as its torpedoes, which calls for a significant heavy gun armament. And it has to be fast. But as it closes in, enemy gunfire is going to be coming in the forward arc, and so the boilers and engines need to be placed as far away from this as possible so that it can maintain its speed, even if the entire foresection is smashed to pieces. With that in mind, the majority of its armament is also going to have to be weighted for the forward arc, so forward firing and broadside firing guns are going to be a priority. In the midst of a swirling melee ship action, as well as obviously plenty of gun smoke and propulsion smoke, a lookout position to signal or yell down to the bridge as to what kind of maneuvers they need to take is going to be vital, and so this will need to be an important consideration as well. Luckily, the existing battleships under construction at this time, the Admiral class, the Victoria class, and the Trafalgar class, all have fairly low freeboards in the first place, and the Victoria class, consisting of Victoria and Sans Pareil, have an additional advantage. Due to their possession of a single large turret mounting some rather monstrous 16.25-inch guns, they already have a setup which would allow for the engines to be placed further backwards, although in the class itself the engines are still roughly amidships. Now, of course, these 10 to 12,000 ton battleships are hardly swift. Their belt armour is incredibly thick, 18 to 20 inches, and their speed is about comparable with Polyphemus at just over 16 knots, and so a little bit of reworking would have to be done. A full ram bow with torpedo tube would have to be included, possibly more than one tube if possible. The gun size would have to be reduced. The 16.25-inch weapons are far too large, so a 12-inch weapon was selected instead. With this much smaller weapon mounted in a twin turret, the barbette could be raised by about half a deck. This gave the guns much better line of sight and would also allow for negative elevation, which would be very important at point-blank range. Since the ship was not expected to have to fight with enemies to its rear, the very angled superstructure of the Sans Pareil class could be discarded in favour of something more along the lines of the Admiral class with a full-width superstructure. The added advantage of this meant that there was more frontage on which light guns could be installed, giving the ship considerably more forward firepower when it came to dealing with small craft such as escorts. The broadside-mounted 6-inch guns would have to be reduced in number, partly to save weight and partly to free up space, and then these could be positioned further forward. The mast, which had generally been positioned aft of the funnels in a lot of British battleship designs at the time, would have to be brought forward and placed immediately behind the bridge to allow for ease of communication with the bridge and to more easily allow spotters to communicate with the bridge crew should the sound-powered telephone or other methods be disrupted or destroyed. A fairly significant power plant would be needed to propel the ship through the water at least 22, possibly even 24 knots, and this meant larger funnels. The repositioning of the mast and the lessening of the broadside guns would mean that this large power plant could be positioned unusually far back for a ship of the period, which would also increase the survivability of the boilers and engines when the ship inevitably took fire from the forward arc. However, just in case some irritating destroyer or small cruiser managed to get in behind the ship on its last run in, a single 9.2-inch gun was mounted aft as a kind of stinger to see off any such annoying hangers-on. The turret, forward section and broadside of the ship would still be protected by relatively thick armour plate, and with a displacement of 8,500 tons, allowing, at least on paper, for 3 such vessels to be bought for the price of 2 conventional battleships, it was anticipated that the Thunderchild class torpedo ram would be able to be constructed in relatively large numbers, both to serve as a good harbour defence vessel, but would also be capable of serving in the battle line, with the concept being that a number of these vessels could be formed into an en-echelon squadron, which would sail in the offside position to the main battle line, and then once the engagement had been joined and the enemy fleet fixed in place in their own line formation, these ships would turn in through the gaps in the British battle line and drive headlong at the enemy, using their 12-inch guns and rapid-fire weapons to inflict significant damage and hopefully cripple the enemy in place, either way following up with a wave of torpedoes and then a final ramming attack on any vessels that appeared to still be mobile. The lead vessel, HMS Thunderchild, would be laid down in 1895, launched in early 1897, and completed into the fleet in early 1898. However, the arrival of the Majestic-class battleships at around the same time caused a pause on the construction of her 2 sister ships, whilst consideration was given to swapping their more traditional turrets out for the new fully armoured barbette style of the Majestics, along with the new 12-inch guns, which promised to have more lethality and longer range. Thus, at the time of the Martian invasion, only Thunderchild would be in service, being assigned to guard the Thames estuary pending the completion of her now half-sisters. When word of the Martian advance was received and the news of the evacuation in progress also signalled, Thunderchild was assigned to guard the evacuation close in, whilst larger units of the Royal Navy stood out to sea in squadrons, waiting for one of the closer-in ships to signal that the Martians had arrived. As it turned out, the battleships of the Royal Navy could not arrive fast enough to save the Thunderchild, but she gave a good account for herself, taking out 3 Martian walkers and safeguarding the evacuation fleet long enough for most of the ships to get away. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I am now happy to unveil what I believe to be the most accurate representation of HMS Thunderchild, as per H.G. Wells' description in War of the Worlds.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.
And yes, for those of you stuck around this long, it will be on a t-shirt, and also available in posters.